Today, we become legends.
Patch OB10 for Smite 2 just launched, and since I've shared my thoughts on the previous patches and some of the issues I had with them, I thought it only fair to also share my thoughts on this patch and why I'm generally enjoying it, and I think it's a good step in the right direction after the OB7 to 9 saga of back-to-back tank nerfs. For those that might not have seen my previous videos on those patches or just want a refresher, my general thoughts were this. Some specific tanks and tank items were too strong and needed nerfs, stuff like Sobek, Odin, Kabrakan, Mystical Mail, Pribwin, Gladshield, Gauntlet of Thebes, etc. However, I was and still am of the belief that tanks as a whole weren't as big of a problem as people made them out to be, and it was mainly just a few outliers, while the rest were either fine or very slightly overtuned and needed some small nerfs. However, OB7 to 9's back-to-back nerfs to every tank item in the entire game was unnecessary in my opinion, and did lead to a meta where tanks were harder to make work than they should be in terms of a healthy and balanced game. However, OB10 has attempted to remedy this in at least some ways with 5 new tank items, 3 of which are live right now and I've been testing out, and the other 2 will be coming later this week or early next week. Contagion was a nice addition for tanks that want to spec into a health stacking build over protections, which I generally think isn't the way to go, but it is good to have an option like that if enemies are stacking penetration against you. I think that makes for a relatively healthy game state with some counter building options. Contagion also provides capped anti-heal in one item, which is pretty insane. Of course, it's on a cooldown and not as easy to keep applied compared to something like Ang, but that's the trade-off you make. And with anti-healing being basically necessary in more than half of your games at the moment, this item is really nice for tanks to have as an alternative to Ang. Erosion, which launches later this week, is going to be amazing to have as we are sorely lacking in good anti-shield options at the moment. There's a lot of strong shielding in the meta, which means Erosion is going to not only get a lot of anti-shield value, but also be providing that plus 10% protection boost very frequently in fights if you're buying this into like an Odin, Yamoja, Geb, or the myriad of strong shield items right now. Heroism being the main one, the item is completely OP, but there's also a lot of shells and Pribwins going around, and even some Bloodbound books and Blood Forges. We've yet to actually play with this item, but I imagine it will be a very valuable addition to the tank item pool once it does launch, and its base stats are incredible too. But those are more so just utility tank items that are good, but don't really aim to address the key tankiness problem that OB7 to 9 created. These next 3 items are the team's attempt to fix that. First up is Dwarven Plate, which is a simple percent prot boost, 25% for one and 12.5% for the other, with the choice being yours. I really like this item, and I think it's a great way to achieve actually high protections after all of the prot nerfs of the last few patches. Of course, this is a later buy in your build due to being expensive and having terrible base stats, but if you buy this in 5th or 6th slot in your build and already have like 150 protections from items, this gives 30, so you'll be getting 25% and 12.5% of 180, which is 45 and 23. So in a tanky build, this item is more like 75 physical and 53 magical prot, or the other way around, which by Smite 2 standards and after all the protection nerfs is actually very good prots. It is expensive, but worth the cost in a high protection build, I think. Also, for those wondering if these percent prot boosts stack additively or multiplicatively, from my testing, they are additive and work only off of your protections before other boosts. For example, if you had 100 protections, Dwarven Plate boosts that to 125, and then you proc Freya's Tears for a 15% boost, you gain 15% of the 100, not 15% of the 125. I'm unsure if this is intended or not, since item protections to me should count item passes that are giving protections, but that appears to not be the case currently, and it's only looking at your base protections from the item itself. This makes stacking these items together with each other not quite as good as it probably should be. I'm not sure if that's intended or not, we'll have to see. Speaking of Freya's Tears though, this is one of the other prot payoff items that launch with the patch, with Draconic Scale coming later. Freya's Tears I think is probably the worst of these additions, but it isn't terrible by any means. Just having 20 cooldown rate alone is really nice, as that's hard to come by on a lot of tank items in Smite 2. Breastplate has 20, but is generally not super great at the moment. Pribwin was nerfed down to 12 CDR, and basically everything else has 10 or nothing. It has some protections on it as well, but the main thing here is the passive, granting you plus 15% protections every time you lose 25% of your health. Stacking twice for plus 30% after you lose half of your health. This can be a lifesaver if you're getting CC'd and bursted down. However, this item competes heavily with Spirit Robe, which I think is probably just better at the moment. With a full protection build, this item is going to be giving you roughly a similar amount of protections, but you have to lose half your health first before those prots kick in. Whereas Spirit Robe gives you those immediately on being CC'd and comes with a 6% max health heal on top. Granted, Freya's Tears isn't CC reliant to work, but you're going to get CC'd multiple times when you're diving the backline. That's just a given, so Spirit Robe will likely be active just as often, if not more often, often than this item will be, and gives a similar amount of bonus protections, but also comes with a big heal. As mentioned before though, Freya's Tears does have 20 CDR on it, which is really what differentiates it from Spirit Robe. If your build is lacking CDR, you might lean a little more towards this, but I think as a general statement, Spirit Robe outclasses this item, especially in builds that aren't absolutely maximizing protections, because Spirit Robe gives a flat 40 instead of being reliant on already having a bunch of item protections like Freya's Tears is. But the final new item being added in OB10 is Draconic Scale, which isn't in the game yet, but also on paper at least seems like it will be the best of these 3% prot increase items. The base stats on this are much more attractive than Dwarven Plate, trading 10 of each prots for 300 health, which is a massive upgrade. It's also 100 gold cheaper, and the passive gives you 2 plus 3% protections from items every time you're damaged by a god for that specific damage type. This stacks up to 7 times, so at max stacks this gives 14 flat plus 21% from items, and this can stack for both damage types independently. If you get to max stacks, this item outperforms Dwarven Plate easily, and it's not particularly close. Even with Dwarven Plate's larger 25% boost, a flat 14 plus 21% will be as good or sometimes even better. And you also get that same boost for the other damage type rather than Plate, which gives half of that boost for the other type. Add to that the base stats being so much better on Draconic Scale, and on paper, this item clears Plate easily. But of course, you do have to get this stacked up, which is a relevant detail. Against hit damage gods, this is an auto build, I think, because it will easily stack up almost instantly. Against more single hit burst types of gods though, it does become quite a bit worse. If you get slammed by a Vulcanal at the start of the fight, this is giving you nothing compared to Plate giving you that flat 25% or 12.5% at all times. However, I do think most of the time you'll have at least some stacks on this, and even at a few stacks, this probably outperforms Plate due to the better base stats. The stacks also only decay 1 by 1, so even if you don't take damage for a few seconds in a fight, you'll just lose 1 or 2 stacks and will go back to 7 once you start taking damage again. Also, I'm unsure if this item is going to stack only on god damage or if it will stack on like item proc damage and stuff like that. That could definitely be a relevant detail. If this thing stacks on item proc damage, you know, for example, an ADC with a Tear Thing and a Bragg is in their build, they hit you with a basic attack. If you get 3 stacks there instead of 1 stack, then the item is significantly better. But if it is god damage only, then it's not going to be quite as good. And honestly, it will be hard to tell how good this item is just by looking at it on paper, but my prediction is that it will be much better than Dwarven Plate and by far the best of these protection payoff items once it launches. These new tank items are a great addition, I think. They seem fairly strong, especially Draconic Scale, and they're a lot of fun as well. OB10 also came with some small tank buffs in the form of Spirit Robe getting 5 more of each prots, Hussar's Wings getting 100 more health and a cost reduction, Pharaoh's Curse getting a buff to its attack speed reduction helping you deal with hunters, Berserker Shield's percent prot increase going from 50% to 65, and Eye of Providence getting 50 more health. These are all relatively small buffs in the grand scheme of things though, and these items are still a lot worse than they were a few patches ago due to all the blanket protection nerfs. Overall though, I think the tank additions and changes in this patch were a good step in the right direction, and we'll see how things shake out once all of the new items are in, but I do think there were some things missed in this patch that I would have liked to see. Firstly, I think some underused tank items could use small buffs. Some tank items like Genji's Guard, Breastplate of Valor, Mantle of Discord, and some others that weren't really even used before the tank nerfs are just even worse now. If they weren't good before getting all of their protections nerfed by 20 to 30%, they're even worse now. Some small buffs to these items so they can compete with better tank options will be nice to see. Also, hopefully we can get some better magical defense options in the future, as dedicated magical defense just sucks in the game at the moment outside of only Hunter's Garb, which isn't really even used for its magical defense, just for its mitigation passive. Specifically, a magical defense item with health regen on it will be nice as a good laning phase rush versus a magical matchup, and a magical defense item with some kind of reliable damage output or wave clear passive would also be nice. We have plenty of options in this regard on the physical and mixed side of things, but nothing for purely magical defense. Moving on though, I think crit still needs some nerfs in my opinion. Specifically, Demon Blade and Rage are ridiculous at the moment. Rage should probably get a cost increase, as this would nerf the item while also making it less attractive as a laning phase rush. I've been playing a bit more ADC lately while taking a break from solo lane during OB9, and man is it annoying that Rage Rush is the go-to, as random RNG crits can decide if you win an early game trade or not, which I don't think is healthy for the game. So a cost increase will probably be the best solution here, I think, to dissuade people from rushing it while also just nerfing the item in general. Demon Blade just needs another attack speed nerf in my opinion. 45% attack speed on one item is already kind of nuts, but the fact that it's a crit item is just ridiculous. Crit is supposed to be this higher damage but lower attack speed build path compared to on-hit proc effects that build high attack speed. They shouldn't have access to as much attack speed as Odysseus Bow on a crit item. Nerf this down to 30 or 35% total, and combined with a rage cost increase, that should make crit a lot more tolerable. I also think Soul Reaver probably needs a small nerf, nothing too crazy, but it really is stifling the max health builds at the moment because of how strong it is. Kin size I think is fine as it is though, since it's not as strong, and ADC should have access to a powerful anti-tank option like this. They're meant to be the tank stretchers of the team after all. Speaking of, I've also said before that I generally like the penetration changes that were made in OB9. I just didn't love that they came right after 2 consecutive patches of blanket tank nerfs. However, one thing I don't love about the pen changes is how it polarizes mid laners into gods that can use totem being inherently stronger than gods that can't. Since as a traditional mage, your only percent pen option now is shard at 35%, there's no way to get more than that. Unless you're a totem user, that is, which leads to a weird situation where you sort of just want to play totem users so you have that option of going 54.5% pen if you need to in that game. Whereas non-totem users are just hard capped to shard and that's it. I'm not sure how to handle this really without making shard and totem not stack with each other. Maybe they could add a new item that's sort of like a reverse totem where you get a huge pen buff that falls off each time you damage a god with an ability. That would probably feel bad to use as a design though. Players generally don't like getting weaker because they hit their stuff, but I don't know. This is kind of a hard problem to solve, but worth bringing up, I think. Of course, ADCs can also access 54.5% pen via Executioner and Titan's Bane, but that's way less of a problem for two reasons. Firstly, the vast majority of ADCs can build these items, compared to only a handful of mid laners being able to use both shard and totem, so it doesn't polarize the meta as much. The only ADCs that can't use Executioner are ability-based ones, which is basically just Ula at the moment. Neith is fine because she can build totem and build intelligence, but Ula can't do that. I guess making totem multi-statted like Executioner could help with this a little. At least then strength-based multi-hit gods could use totem. It still wouldn't solve the issue though of multi-hit gods just being inherently better than burst gods because of this though. If anything, it would make the problem worse as strength gods now have the same issue that mid laners have. As I said, hard problem to solve. But back to ADCs, in the traditional context of auto-attacking ADCs, which is like 95% of cases, this really isn't an issue. It doesn't polarize the meta anywhere near as much as totem does. It's also less of an issue for ADCs to have access to such high amounts of percent pen in my view, since as mentioned before, part of the core role's job is to delete tanks. This is why I'm generally more okay with ADCs having insane percent pen, but less so for mages and assassins, as their core job is more aimed at blowing up squishies, not blowing up tanks. Of course, you don't want them to be helpless in the face of tanks or anything, but ADCs should always have access to better penetration and tank shred effects than mages and assassins. One thing I probably would do though is revert the buffs to Executioner and Totem. 54.5% pen in 2 items is a bit ridiculous, especially when you have 7 item slots in Smite 2. That leaves 5 other slots for all the other things you need in your build. Executioner and Totem are also more well statted than Titans and Shard and are cheaper. Yes, they need to stack up, but the fact that they can reach 30% shred, which is as good or even potentially better than 35% pen depending on the situation, is a bit silly, considering that they also have better base stats and are cheaper than Shard and Titans. Revert these items to 4 stacks max and then we're in a good spot in regards to pen in my view, with the exception of the Totem situation in mid, which I don't really have a great solution for. Oh, and one last thing, Stone of Binding needs a serious nerf. I don't see many people building this item, but I don't think they realize it has 40 flat protection reduction on it. Yes, you need to hit 2 hard CCs to get to that 40, but even after 1 hard CC, it's still a flat 20 reduction, which is strong in itself. If you're on a god that can hard CC twice easily, or use an item like Cersei's Hexstone or Gargoyle to apply the second stack though, this item is nuts. It should be nerfed down to 7.5% pen per stack for a total of 30 in my opinion. No one talks about this item, but it passively does a lot of work in terms of increasing your damage as a tank, and it's probably too strong as it is. But anyway, that's probably enough on this topic. To summarize, OB10 was a good step in the right direction in regards to the tank situation. The new items seem pretty strong but not broken or anything, perhaps with the exception of Draconic Scale, but we're yet to test that. The small tank item buffs were also nice, but I do think some of the lesser used tank items still deserve small buffs to compensate for their unjustified nerfs and the crossfire from the blanket protection decreases. Stone of Binding could use a nerf, Crit and Soul Reaver could also use nerfs, and I would also like to see Totem and Executioner reverted back to 24% shred instead of 30. But what are your thoughts on the new patch, and are you a DPS or a tank main? Let me know down below and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.